Let's go to Mitch Heimpel. He's a conservative strategist with Enterprise Canada and joined us now to talk some more about this. Mitch, thanks for your time tonight. What do you think was, I'm going to say, the greatest accomplishment in the political realm for Brian Mulroney?
There's a lot to even try to list them. The free trade agreement between Canada and the United States will probably be at the top of a lot of people's list. I've always had a particular affinity for the international fight he led against apartheid in South Africa. I think those would probably be two of the top things I would list.
Okay, let's talk about what led him to some of the choices he made, because as I've been discussing with other strategists, this was a man who was a progressive conservative, but definitely made some choices and pursued some issues that were not really conservative issues necessarily. You mentioned human rights, you mentioned apartheid. What led him to take up that fight?
So on apartheid, for example, that had actually been a legacy issue for the progressive conservatives. John Diefenbaker, before Mulroney, had a strong position on it too. It's just Mulroney was so active on the international scene that he often he drew the ire of Margaret Thatcher in the note she left for her personal biographer for how strident he was on the issue. The one thing that seems to be a constant in Brian Mulroney's political career is that if he felt strongly enough about something, whether it was the environment, the Acid Rain Treaty with the United States is a good example, or apartheid, he didn't give up on it until he had what he wanted, or the defeat was so final, there was no revisiting it, as in the case of the Charlottetown Accord.
He also worked really well with the opposition. And tell me if you think that was just a different era in politics, or that had to do with who he was personally and as a politician, or both.
I think it probably had a lot to do with who he was personally. I think the best example of what you're talking about is appointing Stephen Lewis as the ambassador to the United Nations, which heavily involved Canada in the fight against AIDS in the 80s. I think that is a tribute to the person he was. I don't even think you necessarily have to cross partisan lines to talk about that. Brian Mulroney is a man who ran against Joe Clark twice for the leadership of his own party, and then made him an instrumental and central cabinet minister in his government. So Brian Mulroney had the ability that is rare among politicians, regardless of the era, to really take people with whom he'd had past disagreements or past run-ins and make them allies and often teammates in the same cause.
Yeah, we just heard from Jean Chrétien, who talked about Brian Mulroney being like the guy you played opposite, on the ice when you're playing a hockey game. He's the guy you're fighting with, but you're having a beer with after it's all over. And they had that kind of relationship. They apparently still phoned each other occasionally, even now, a few months ago. So this was sort of that friend and foe mentality that I think back in that era was much more prominent than it is today. Talk to me about how he was able to break through in Quebec at a time when it was completely liberal territory. Jean Chrétien spoke about that time and that being one of the sort of big political moves, strategic moves he made that paid off.
Yeah, the 1984 electoral victory in particular was resounding for conservatives because they just swept the entire country. I think only John Diefenbaker's victory in '58 is even close. That there was so much to go into that. Mulroney's personal story, the boy from Baie-Comeau legend, was instrumental in sort of how he approached Quebecers. The man was also effortlessly bilingual. You could not tell what his first language was if you tried. And there's almost no other prime minister for whom that has been the case. The current prime minister is probably the only one that comes close in that respect. But also, Brian Mulroney knew how to talk about Canada as a nation, as a place distinct from its past, but also with a unique patriotism that I think appeals to a certain sensibility in Quebecers, and certainly did at the time. And this was a time between 1980 and 1995 when we were in the midst of the height of separatism. And he managed to have a vision for Canada that included Quebec, that was very much rooted in who we are as a nation, but also who we can be in our future. And that was instrumental to a lot of the policy decisions he made as well.
Yeah, tell me about that fine line, because, people today might not remember that time when it was even more fractious, when the relationship between, the rest of Canada and Quebec was really difficult and really hard to hard to not only understand, but hard to gauge. It changed all the time, but it was never friendly. And he had to walk that fine line as somebody who was from Quebec, but who was trying to represent Canada.
I think there are a couple of testaments to this. I think you can look at the fact that Brian Mulroney's tent in Quebec was so expansive that it would include Lucien Bouchard, who would go on to later become the Parti Québécois premier of the province of Quebec. But if it's one of the great historical sort of counterfactuals in Canadian history, if Meech Lake had passed and Brian Mulroney had managed to get Quebec's name or Quebec's signature on the Constitution, how different his legacy would have immediately been. He's undergone a substantial sort of recovery, as people have considered his legacy in whole over the last decade or so. Because he retired. When he retired, he wasn't quite popular, and nobody made better or more jokes about that than he did. But if he had managed to successfully pass Meech Lake in the 80s, it is worth considering how different Canada's relationship with Quebec would have been in the early 90s, and we likely never would have had the 95 referendum.
Yeah, instrumental in trying to make some strides there. When you look back at his environmental record and his push for climate efforts, acid rain is something that we've mentioned before. Why do you think that rang true to him? I know he grew up in a small town in Quebec, and there is an American presence in the small town. I'm just wondering how the environmental issues got to be important to him.
I think appointing Jean Charest, the environment minister, probably had something to do with that. When you have somebody with his particular political skill, which Mulroney has acknowledged many times, he sort of recognized a little bit of himself in. That was important there. I think also he had the unique ability to take issues that people brought to his attention and really derive what the popular Canadian consensus was going to be from them. So in the Acid Rain Treaty, which is a good example, getting the American signature on that treaty is to this day probably the most impressive thing a Canadian prime minister has managed to get an American president to do with regard to the environment in Canadian politics. He, like the initial sort of climate change conventions that took place under the UN, Canada played a major role in with Jean Charest as the environment minister. I believe that was at Rio in the early 90s. So it was something that was very much a part of his legacy. He went down, I think it was in the early 2000s, the Sierra Club named him as the greenest prime minister in Canadian history. So it's definitely an instrumental part of his legacy, and something that at the time wouldn't have seemed extraordinary and probably does now.
Yeah, at the time, even looking back, it seems extraordinary, but definitely ahead of his time as far as looking at the issues for the environment and for climate. Mitch, I got to leave it there with you, sir, but thank you for your time today. Appreciate you joining us on the program.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.